The air of Athens still shimmers with the ghosts of titans. Its very name evokes the birth of democracy, the cradle of Western thought, the crucible where art, philosophy, and politics converged in an explosion of human potential. But within this golden age, where freedom of speech was revered and intellectual curiosity boundless, a single figure emerged who would challenge every assumption, every tradition, every comfortable lie. A man whose name echoes through millennia, a titan whose shadow stretches across every philosophical debate, every ethical dilemma, every quest for truth that has followed. Yet, in his own time, this titan was a convicted criminal, condemned to death by the very city he sought to enlighten. His empire wasn't built on land or gold, but on questions. His method, a relentless interrogation of assumptions, shattered complacency and forced uncomfortable truths into the light. He built no schools, wrote no books, yet his students would become the architects of entire philosophical systems that still shape our world. His relentless pursuit of wisdom, his public unmasking of ignorance disguised as knowledge, earned him not just disciples, but powerful, dangerous enemies. The sophists, the politicians, the traditionalists, all felt the sting of his intellectual gadfly. From the humble workshop of a stonecutter, he ascended not to earthly power, but to an unparalleled spiritual and intellectual authority, shaping minds and movements that would define civilization. Was he a selfless seeker of truth, a martyr for intellectual freedom, a prophet of reason, or a disruptive force, a provocateur whose radical ideas undermined the very fabric of Athenian society, leading to its demise? Was his death a tragic injustice, or the inevitable consequence of a man who refused to compromise, even when it meant his own destruction? This is the story of Socrates, the man who taught the world how to think, and in doing so sealed his own fate. A story of unparalleled genius, profound conviction, and a brutal end that forever stains the cradle of democracy. Chapter 1. The Crucible of Athens. To understand Socrates, we must first understand the city that birthed him, nurtured his genius, and ultimately executed him. 5th century BCE Athens was a city in flux, a vibrant, volatile democracy that had emerged from the shadow of the Persian Wars as a dominant naval power and the cultural heart of the Greek world. This was the Golden Age, an era of unprecedented political hegemony, economic growth, and cultural flourishing under leaders like Pericles. The Parthenon rose. Playwrights like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides penned their timeless tragedies, and historians like Herodotus and Thucydides recorded the epic struggles of their time. Athenian democracy, or demokratia, was a radical experiment in direct citizen rule. Male citizens, regardless of wealth, held the right to speak and vote in the assembly, the primary governing body. Juries, often numbering in the hundreds, were chosen by lot, and public offices were increasingly paid, allowing poorer citizens to participate in the political life of the city. This system fostered an environment of intense public debate, where persuasive speech was not merely an art, but a crucial tool for political power and self-defense in legal disputes. It was into this intellectual ferment that the sophists arrived. These itinerant professional teachers, traveling across the Greek-speaking world, offered instruction in rhetoric, public speaking, and a wide range of subjects for a fee. They capitalized on the growing demand among the Athenian elite and aspiring newcomers for skills essential to success in public life. The sophists taught arete, or virtue and excellence, which in democratic Athens was increasingly understood as the ability to influence fellow citizens through rhetorical persuasion. Figures like Protagoras, who famously claimed he could make the weaker argument the stronger, became notorious for their relativistic views on truth and morality, suggesting that truth was subjective and dependent on individual perspective. While they made genuine contributions to the development of rhetoric and critical thinking, their focus on persuasion over objective truth and their acceptance of payment often earned them antipathy and a reputation for intellectual charlatanism. Socrates, born around 470 BCE, was not one of these wealthy traveling intellectuals. His father, Sophroniscus, was a stonemason and sculptor, and his mother, Phaenarete, a midwife. His family was not impoverished, but certainly not of the aristocratic background that often produced philosophers or attracted sophists. He himself is said to have followed his father's profession as a sculptor for a time, with tradition even crediting him with a statue of the Graces. He also served with distinction as a hoplite, an armored foot soldier in several campaigns during the Peloponnesian War, demonstrating physical endurance and courage. But Socrates' true calling lay not in stone or battle, but in the relentless pursuit of wisdom. The pivotal moment in his life, and perhaps in the history of Western philosophy, came from an unexpected source, the Oracle of Delphi. His friend Chaerephon, eager to know if anyone was wiser than Socrates, posed the question to the Pythia, the high priestess of Apollo. The oracle's pronouncement was unequivocal: none. Socrates, despite his growing reputation, was bewildered by this declaration. He claimed to know nothing, adhering to the principle of "I know that I know nothing." Believing that the divine oracle could not lie, he embarked on what he considered a divine mission, to prove the oracle wrong by finding someone wiser than himself. He began to question those with a reputation for wisdom, politicians, poets, craftsmen, in the workshops, and the bustling agora, the public square that served as the heart of Athenian life. This was the birth of the Socratic method, also known as the Socratic elenchus. It was a form of cooperative, argumentative dialogue based on asking and answering questions, designed to stimulate critical thinking and expose contradictions in an interlocutor's beliefs. Socrates would engage someone claiming expertise on a subject, then, through a series of probing questions, meticulously peel back layers of their assumptions, leading them to realize the inconsistencies and limitations of their own knowledge. He found, to his dismay, that those with the highest reputations for wisdom were often the most lacking in it, while ordinary people sometimes held more genuine, if unarticulated, intelligence. The youth of Athens, captivated by his intellectual prowess and the spectacle of their elders being publicly unmasked, flocked to him, delighting in watching Socrates question and challenge the established figures. Among his followers were some of Athens' most prominent young men, including Plato, who would become his most famous student and through whose dialogues much of Socrates' philosophy is preserved. Others included Alcibiades, a brilliant but volatile general, and Critias, who would later become one of the ruthless 30 tyrants who briefly overthrew Athenian democracy. It was precisely this public questioning, this relentless exposure of ignorance, that sowed the seeds of his destruction. While Socrates saw his mission as a service to the city, urging Athenians to examine their lives and strive for true knowledge rather than accepting conventional wisdom, his method inherently challenged authority, tradition, and the fragile egos of powerful men. He made enemies. Many, particularly those he publicly embarrassed, perceived him as a threat to their established order, their reputations, and even the stability of the Athenian state. The very act of encouraging young men to question everything their parents, teachers, and leaders told them was seen as corrupting the youth. This intellectual friction, simmering beneath the surface of Athens' golden age, would eventually boil over into a dramatic confrontation, setting the stage for one of history's most infamous trials. Chapter 2. The Trial of the Gadfly. The intellectual friction, simmering beneath the surface of Athens' golden age, eventually boiled over into a dramatic confrontation, setting the stage for one of history's most infamous trials. It was 399 BCE, and Athens was still reeling from the devastating defeat in the Peloponnesian War against Sparta, a conflict that had dragged on for nearly 3 decades and shattered the city's imperial ambitions. The war had culminated in the brutal reign of the 30 tyrants, an oligarchic junta installed by Sparta, which had unleashed a reign of terror, executing thousands of citizens and confiscating property. Among these tyrants were Critias and Charmides, both former associates and students of Socrates. Though Socrates himself had bravely defied the 30 on at least one occasion, refusing an unlawful order, his past associations with figures who had brought such devastation to the city made him a convenient scapegoat in the fragile, newly restored democracy. The charges against Socrates were formal and grave, brought by 3 prominent citizens: Meletus, a poet; Anytus, a powerful democrat and craftsman; and Lycon, an orator. The indictment, publicly displayed in the Agora, read, "Socrates is guilty of corrupting the youth and of not believing in the gods in whom the city believes, but in other new divinities." These were not trivial accusations in Athenian society. Asabeia, or impiety, was a serious religious offense, punishable by death. It implied a direct threat to the social and political order, as the state's well-being was believed to be intrinsically linked to the favor of the gods. Corrupting the youth, while less clearly defined, tapped into deep anxieties about the erosion of traditional values and the perceived moral decay of a generation that had witnessed war, tyranny, and the rise of relativistic sophistic thought. The accusers were essentially arguing that Socrates was a dangerous innovator, undermining the very foundations of Athenian society and religion. The trial itself was a public spectacle, held in the open air, likely in the Agora. The jury, a massive body of 501 male citizens, was chosen by lot, reflecting the democratic ideal of citizen participation. There were no judges in the modern sense, no lawyers to professionally argue cases. Both accuser and accused presented their arguments directly to the jury, who would then vote. Plato's Apology, meaning defense, not an expression of regret, offers the most comprehensive account of Socrates' address to this formidable jury. It paints a picture of a man utterly unbowed, refusing to employ the customary rhetorical flourishes or emotional appeals expected of a defendant. He did not beg for mercy, nor did he parade his crying children before the jury, as was common practice. Instead, Socrates stood before them as he had lived, a relentless seeker of truth, determined to expose ignorance, even when it sealed his own fate. He began by acknowledging the prejudice against him, cultivated over years by slander and misunderstanding. He addressed the charge of corrupting the youth by arguing that no one willingly corrupts another, for to do so would invite harm upon themselves. If he corrupted anyone, he claimed, it must have been unintentionally, and therefore he should have been privately instructed, not publicly prosecuted. He pointed out the irony. Meletus, his accuser, claimed to care deeply for the youth, yet had never shown any practical concern for their education. On the charge of impiety, Socrates famously explained his divine sign, an inner voice or daemon that often warned him against certain actions but never commanded him. This, he argued, was not a denial of the gods, but rather an experience of a personal, divine guidance, consistent with the oracle of Delphi's pronouncement that no one was wiser than he. He insisted that his entire philosophical mission, the questioning of others, the urging of Athenians to examine their lives, was a service to the god Apollo, fulfilling the oracle's prophecy by demonstrating that true wisdom lay in recognizing one's own ignorance. It was in this defense that Socrates articulated the core of his philosophy, a statement that would echo through the ages. The unexamined life is not worth living. He presented himself not as a criminal, but as a gadfly, sent by the gods to sting the complacent Athenian state into a state of self-awareness. He knew that by telling them these uncomfortable truths, by exposing their superficial knowledge and moral complacency, he was making powerful enemies. But he would not stop. He declared that he would rather die than abandon his philosophical mission, for it was his sacred duty. The jury, accustomed to defendants who pleaded for their lives, must have been stunned by Socrates' audacity. His calm, unwavering conviction, his refusal to compromise, and his intellectual superiority likely alienated many jurors further. When the votes were cast on the question of guilt, Socrates was convicted by a relatively narrow margin, 280 votes to 221. This was not an overwhelming condemnation, suggesting significant division even among his accusers. Then came the penalty phase. Athenian law allowed the convicted to propose an alternative punishment to that demanded by the prosecution. Miletus had proposed death. Socrates, instead of offering exile or a fine he could barely afford, delivered another defiant, almost mocking proposal. He suggested that, as a public benefactor who had helped the city by tirelessly spurring its citizens to virtue, he deserved to be honored with free meals in the Prytaneum, a privilege typically reserved for Olympic victors and esteemed public figures. This was the final insult, the ultimate act of intellectual provocation. To the jurors, it must have seemed like contempt of court. It confirmed their perception of his arrogance and his disregard for their authority. The second vote was taken, and this time the margin for the death penalty was significantly wider, turning his conviction into an execution order. Socrates received the verdict with characteristic composure. He showed no fear, no regret. He used the remaining time to address the jurors who had voted for his acquittal, assuring them that death held no terror for a good man. He prophesied that his accusers, in condemning him, would face a far harsher judgment from history, and that his students would continue his work, ensuring that his legacy would live on. The difficulty, my friends, he told them, is not to avoid death, but to avoid unrighteousness, for that runs faster than death. He was then led to the state prison, a simple building near the Agora. His execution was delayed for several weeks due to a sacred Athenian mission to Delos, during which no executions could take place. This gave his friends and disciples, including Plato and Crito, ample time to visit him and plot his escape. In Plato's dialogue, Crito, we find Socrates' most profound arguments against fleeing. Crito, distraught, pleaded with him, assuring him that escape was easily arranged, that his friends had the money, and that it was unjust for him to remain and die, abandoning his family and his philosophical mission. But Socrates, ever the man of principle, refused. He argued that to escape would be to break his implicit contract with the laws of Athens, laws under which he had lived his entire life and which had provided him with his education and his freedom. He believed that one must never commit injustice, even in return for injustice. To defy the city's laws, even when they were wrongly applied to him, would be to undermine the very concept of law and order, which he held sacred. It would also validate the charges against him and make him appear a hypocrite, abandoning the principles he had preached. For it is not life that matters, but good life, he asserted, defining a good life as one lived justly and honorably. On his final day, surrounded by his weeping disciples, Socrates remained calm, even cheerful. He spent his last hours discussing the immortality of the soul, as recounted in Plato's Phaedo. He comforted his friends, urging them not to grieve, but to live good lives. As the sun set, the executioner arrived with the hemlock, a poisonous draught. Socrates drank it without hesitation, walking around until his legs felt heavy, then lying down. His last words, spoken to Crito, were, "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay it and do not neglect it." Asclepius was the Greek god of healing, and the offering of a cock was a traditional thanksgiving for recovery from illness. In Socrates' final moments, he saw death not as an end, but as a release, a healing from the illness of earthly life. He died peacefully, a martyr to his convictions, his passing marking a brutal end to one of history's most brilliant minds. The death of Socrates sent shockwaves through the philosophical world and beyond. While some Athenians may have felt a temporary sense of relief that the gadfly was silenced, many others, including his students, were devastated. Plato, who was present at his teacher's death, would dedicate his life to preserving Socrates' memory and ideas, forever shaping Western thought through his monumental dialogues. The unjust execution of Socrates would forever stain the reputation of Athenian democracy, transforming a philosopher into a symbol of intellectual freedom and martyrdom, a testament to the brutal consequences of a society that fears the truth. Chapter 3. The Socratic Legacy. Echoes through millennia. Socrates left no writings. His entire philosophical output, his method, and his character are known to us almost exclusively through the accounts of his students and contemporaries, primarily Plato and Xenophon. This absence of his own words presents a unique challenge and opportunity for understanding his legacy. It means that Socrates, as we know him, is to a significant extent a construction, filtered through the interpretations and literary aims of his disciples. Yet despite this, the impact of his life and death on Western philosophy, ethics, and education is immeasurable, reverberating through millennia. Plato's dialogues are the cornerstone of our understanding of Socrates. In early dialogues like the Apology, Crito, and Euthyphro, Socrates appears as a consistent character, relentlessly pursuing definitions of virtue, justice, piety, and knowledge, often exposing the ignorance of his interlocutors. These dialogues capture the essence of the Socratic method. The elenchus, a process of cross-examination designed to expose contradictions and lead to a deeper understanding of one's own beliefs. This method, emphasizing critical thinking and self-knowledge, remains a foundational tool in education and philosophy to this day. It transformed philosophical inquiry from speculative cosmology to a rigorous examination of human conduct and morality. As Plato matured, the character of Socrates in his dialogues began to express more of Plato's own developing philosophical theories, particularly the theory of forms, the concept of the ideal state, and the immortality of the soul. This has led to the enduring Socratic problem, distinguishing the historical Socrates from Plato's literary creation. Regardless, the figure of Socrates, as depicted by Plato, became the embodiment of the philosopher, a person dedicated to truth, reason, and moral integrity, even unto death. Beyond Plato, Xenophon, another student, presented a more pragmatic and conventional Socrates, emphasizing his piety, patriotism, and practical wisdom. While Xenophon's accounts lack the philosophical depth of Plato's, they provide a valuable counterpoint, showcasing a Socrates perhaps less intellectually challenging but more appealing to traditional Athenian values. The immediate impact of Socrates' death was profound. His students, dispersed and disillusioned with Athenian democracy, went on to establish their own schools of thought. Plato founded the Academy, arguably the first institution of higher learning in the Western world, which would train generations of philosophers, including Aristotle. Other Socratic schools emerged, such as the Cynics, founded by Antisthenes, who emphasized asceticism and rejection of societal conventions, and the Cyrenaics, founded by Aristippus, who advocated for pleasure as the highest good. Though these schools diverged wildly in their doctrines, they all trace their intellectual lineage back to the gadfly of Athens, inheriting his emphasis on ethics and the examined life. The Socratic legacy is not merely confined to ancient Greece. His relentless questioning and emphasis on critical self-reflection laid the groundwork for rational inquiry that would define Western thought. The Enlightenment, centuries later, found inspiration in Socrates' commitment to reason over dogma. Thinkers like René Descartes, with his famous "I think, therefore I am," echoed Socrates' emphasis on individual thought and the rejection of unexamined assumptions. His martyrdom, too, became a powerful symbol. For centuries, Socrates has been viewed as the quintessential intellectual hero, a man who chose principle over life, truth over expediency. His trial and execution serve as a timeless cautionary tale about the dangers of intellectual intolerance and the fragility of freedom of thought, even in a democracy. It highlights the tension between the individual's pursuit of truth and the state's desire for order and conformity. Even today, in classrooms and courtrooms, the Socratic method is employed to stimulate critical thinking and uncover underlying assumptions. The concept of Socratic irony, where one feigns ignorance to draw out an interlocutor's flawed reasoning, is a pervasive rhetorical tool. His insistence that virtue is knowledge continues to fuel debates about moral education and the relationship between understanding and ethical behavior. Yet, despite his profound influence, the duality of Socrates persists. Was he the selfless seeker of truth, or a disruptive force whose radical ideas contributed to the instability of his city? His refusal to participate directly in Athenian politics, beyond his military service and occasional jury duty, was seen by some as a dereliction of civic responsibility. His public questioning, while aimed at truth, often humiliated those he interrogated, fostering resentment. And his association with figures like Alcibiades and Critias, who proved disastrous for Athens, cast a long shadow, however unfair. The story of Socrates is a testament to the enduring power of ideas, even those unwritten. It reveals how a man who owned nothing, built no monuments, and held no political office could, through the sheer force of his intellect and conviction, change the course of human thought. His death, a brutal consequence of his uncompromising pursuit of truth, ironically cemented his immortality, ensuring that the gadfly would continue to sting, to provoke and to inspire generations to question, to examine, and to live lives worthy of examination.